It's hard to imagine how we got around before GPS. I use it almost every day, and it makes my life so much easier. But sometimes it puts me into unexpected situations. For example, a few weeks ago, I had an appointment up in Rochester. I live in a suburb to the south. I plugged in the address and hopped on the expressway. There must have been an accident up ahead because my GPS rerouted and took me off the highway. This detour caught me by surprise. I didn't know where I was. And then I started to recognize the street names from the news. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I suddenly felt very out of place. I kept following the GPS, eyes forward, hands firmly on the wheel, as if somehow that made me invisible. Around me, people were just minding their own business, chatting outside the corner store or waiting for the bus. And yet, there I was, having a visceral reaction. I felt insecure and anxious. I questioned my safety. Why? Why did I feel the urge to lock my doors and not make eye contact? What kind of neighbor does that make me? This story is embarrassing, but true. And if we're honest, things like this, these little microaggressions, happen all the time. Today, I want to unpack that experience. I want to understand how history has shaped our streets and our stereotypes. So far, I haven't mentioned race, but you've probably read between the lines. Full disclosure, I'm white. I grew up in a white suburban bubble and went to a predominantly white high school. In some ways, I think this absence of diversity sparked a deep curiosity. In college, I studied global inequality and development. Essentially, I researched people and the systemic problems they face. My studies took me to East Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America, and I was certain I would end up somewhere overseas. But in all my experience abroad, I learned a critical lesson. I was always a foreigner. No matter how culturally competent I was, there was always a barrier of being the other. There's an irreplaceable authenticity of being from a place, a depth of knowledge and genuine connection that cannot be taught. These experiences allowed me to see the problems in my own backyard. The hard truth is, the inequality around us isn't something we learn in school. When you think of racism, what's the first thing that comes to mind? If I had to guess, it would probably be something like this. Or maybe this. But what about this? What are we even looking at here, and how can this be racist? A quick disclaimer, I love the city of Rochester. There is much to be proud of, past and present, but there are some ugly lessons from history that we can't just sweep under the rug. Rochester is one of the most spatially segregated cities in the country, meaning that the street you live on is a strong predictor of the color of your skin and the balance of your bank account. This is most apparent in our school districts. The city schools are mostly black, and the suburban schools are mostly white. The suburban schools consistently rank among some of the best public schools in the nation. Drive a few miles down the road, and the city schools rank among the worst. Here's where we start to bump into myths about race, poverty, and culture. We try to explain these stark differences between the city schools and the suburban schools. Secretly, some of us blame the students for these disparities. Others blame music and the media. We latch onto these silver bullet one-liners. If only there was a father in the house, or if only they took more personal responsibility. But none of these things can explain why hardworking families are still struggling to survive. This truth challenges the very core of our American dream. If you work hard, you'll succeed. So, how did this happen? How did we get so separated? To answer that question, let me take you back to 1834. Rochester was established on the banks of the Genesee River. From its founding to 1900, the population swelled from 12,000 to over 160,000. During that same 60 years, the African American population grew only slightly, from 300 to roughly 600 or 700. Among those early residents was Frederick Douglass, and like Douglass, many of the first black residents were freedmen or runaway slaves. Rochester was a stop on the Underground Railroad, and so a small black community took root in Rochester's 3rd Ward near Clarissa Street. Before we continue, let's take a look at where we are. Here's a map of Rochester from 1901, and it shows the historic ward boundaries. These boundaries no longer technically exist, but their legacy continues. First, let's take a look at the 3rd Ward. It's on the west side of the river, just below Main Street. Historically, this is where some of the richest people lived, and was once home to Nathaniel Rochester, the city's namesake. At the very southern tip of the ward is Clarissa Street, and this is where the original freedmen settled. The other important space to point out is the 7th Ward, also known as the Baden-Ormond area. This, if you can see, the railroad cuts the neighborhood in half. It was a vital commercial and industrial hub before the city's automobile revolution. Okay, so back to our story. At this point, around 1900, the non-white population is small but strong. And over the next few decades, the African-American population would grow exponentially. Each world war brought a new wave of southern migrants to the city. Moving up from the south, these immigrants may have hoped to find refuge from Jim Crow and other violent vestiges of the slave states. But in truth, they would face more of the same. The North masked segregation in public policy and urban planning. 3 of the most effective tools used to segregate the city are redlining, housing discrimination, and urban renewal. These are just 3 pieces of the puzzle of structural racism, a concept so all-encompassing, it's often difficult to understand. But redlining, housing discrimination, and urban renewal continue to shape our city's legacy, and yet remains largely ignored. After World War I and the Great Depression, President Roosevelt initiated the New Deal in order to stimulate our economy. Programs were created to make home buying more affordable and to rescue the poor from foreclosure. In order to decide who had access to these funds, the government made a map of every American city. Here is Rochester's map. Each color represents the risk of investment. The green neighborhoods were subsidized by government money, and the red neighborhoods were not. Scholars have coined this practice redlining, specifically referring to the red ink that marked the condemned neighborhoods. Let's take a look at the 7th Ward. The official report describes the residents as day laborers and others on government relief. This was an immigrant neighborhood populated by, quote, Hebrews, Italians, and Negroes. I should note that at this time in our history, Jews and Italians were not yet considered white. The houses in this area were in major need of repair, yet they were denied government funding. Similarly, the 3rd Ward was another target of redlining. This neighborhood was over 75%, quote, Negro. Listen to what disqualified this neighborhood from funding. Years ago, this was a section of beautiful old homes. Some still remain, massive structures and still handsome, but with no value except for conversion purposes. Negroes have come into the area, and today it is the poorest section in the entire city. Over the course of the century, the 3rd Ward was both the richest and the poorest neighborhood in Rochester. These reports became self-fulfilling. By redlining these zones, residents' access to financing was severely limited. This has resulted in a generational loss of wealth and perpetuated impoverishment. World War II brought another wave of southern migrants. They were packed into these 2 neighborhoods and created a housing crisis. In the late 50s, a government report titled Negroes in 5 New York Cities tells the story of 2 Rochester ghettos, the Baden-Ormond area in Ward 7 and the Clarissa Street area in Ward 3. These 2 neighborhoods housed over 80% of the city's African-American population. The housing conditions were overcrowded and unsanitary. A quarter of residents had no running water or private bathroom. This was in 1958, only 60 years ago, and nearly 5,000 people in an American city had no running water. Moving out of these two neighborhoods was almost impossible, even for those with the economic means to do so. The report found that the purchase of housing was humiliating and difficult. And of the 5 cities studied, only in Rochester were there reports of widespread neighborhood resistance to integration. The truth is, non-whites paid more money for worse housing. And if they tried to move out, they were faced with intense discrimination. Newly built suburban neighborhoods were bound by restrictive covenants, excluding people of color and Jews. These exclusions were intended to preserve property values and promote social harmony. But in reality, the entire real estate industry inflamed racial tensions. They made money off of white fear, and they intimidated black buyers. By the 60s, nearly every city in New York had built low-income public housing, and yet Rochester lagged sorely behind. Rochester's first public housing projects, the Hanover houses, were designed to hold less than 140 units. The developers subdivided the complex into nearly 400 units, tripling the population density. Over time, the Hanover houses became known as overcrowded, unsafe, and dilapidated. And now we start to understand how the projects became such a negative stereotype. In the 60s and 70s, plans for urban renewal swept headlines across the nation. Essentially, the idea was to bulldoze poor neighborhoods and develop atop the newly cleared land. This practice later became known as Negro removal. At the heart of the 7th Ward, 60 acres of slum were cleared, displacing 600 families and 150 businesses. Only 300 housing units were rebuilt. And furthermore, there was an integration standard imposed, requiring an equal ratio to white to non-white tenants. So let me break that down. 600 families displaced, only 300 units rebuilt, and on top of that, 150 of those units had to go to white tenants. So in theory, a seemingly progressive desegregation policy perpetuated injustice. Soon after, the following neighborhoods were also cleared, and so today, a soda factory and warehouses have replaced what was once the most densely populated section of the city. During the same time, urban planners were drafting designs for the Inner Loop, a highway that would encircle downtown Rochester. The idea was to reconnect the white flight suburban population to the central business district. This highway cut through both wards, requiring further demolition of poor neighborhoods. Over time, this barrier became known as a noose around the neck of Rochester. The highway became a massive physical barrier to urban residents, isolating them from the economic heart of the city. In recent years, projects have tried to repair that damage by filling in the Inner Loop. And yet, the scar of urban renewal will remain for generations. This story, although specific to Rochester, is not unique. The same tools were used in almost every city across the country. I am not an expert on these issues, and I certainly don't have all the answers. But digging into our shared story offers clarity. We have to understand our history and recognize our place in it. For too long, we have bought into the idea that those in poverty are poor because there is something wrong with them, that they have done something to deserve less. Worse still, we have convinced ourselves that those with money, power, and privilege have done something to deserve more. History tells a different story. In our separation, we have made monsters out of one another, and we have been blind to our shared humanity. Yet, if we are to truly open our eyes, we have to resist the temptation of colorblindness. To say, "I don't see color," is dangerous and robs people of their full identity. We cannot be paralyzed by guilt and blame. Instead, we must embrace our discomfort and engage with empathy and understanding. This subject is messy and complex, but we have an obligation to know why and how we've been divided. And now we have to decide what to do. So here's my challenge to you. Learn your hometown history. Question your own assumptions. And most importantly, share. Share what makes you angry and what makes you proud. The only thing between us and another 100 years of injustice is silence.